Welcome everyone to Environmental, Social, and Governance, Understanding the New Era of Corporate Compliance and Sustainability webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. Today's presentation is being recorded and the recording will be available within Academy within 2 business days. As you have questions, you may post them in the Zoom Q&A function and we will answer questions at the end of the call. We will try our best to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation, but if for whatever reason we are unable to get to your question today, please email learning@nfp.com. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Joining us today are Lauren Kim, Senior Vice President and Legal and Technical Leader at NFP, Chris Alvigi, Managing Director of Environmental at NFP, Peter Kelso, Principal of Economic and Complex Analytics at Brew Associates Incorporated, and Drew Howard, Managing Consultant of Economic and Complex Analytics of Brew Associates Incorporated. We are very excited to have them speaking with us today. It is my pleasure to hand the call over to our speaker. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amber. Glad everybody could join us today for Do You Know ESG, Environmental Expectations for the Corporate World. I think that's one of the things we'll be educating a lot of people about today is what ESG, what is ESG? It's an acronym that's taken kind of hold over, especially the past couple of years, as it's kind of gravitated from the investment community to government. And now that the two are, working in concert, I think it's something that's going to affect potentially, the company you work at, some of the investments you make, and also how we, work with the environment over time. We're gonna deal a lot with the E in ESG today, but all three are somewhat intertwined. So I'm happy to join Lauren, Chris, and Drew today on the panel. We came up with an agenda. The over/under on my dogs were barking was 2, so we're at 1 right now. We'll see if we can keep the under. We came up with an agenda, I think, that covers a lot of the different things that are going on with ESG that are important, a lot of different issues. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define and describe what ESG is. We're going to talk about, going to give some context, kind of the backdrop of the global rise of ESG in the investment community. We're going to talk about the 3 different drivers, right? So we talked a little bit about investment community, government, but what's really driving this is climate risk, and how that's going to work into the U.S. government here at home, and what our federal and state regulatory framework is going to be in relation to the environment. We'll talk about a couple of the prongs of the U.S. government's climate plan. One that is somewhat imminent in terms of what the government's going to mandate in terms of corporate disclosure. We're going to talk about environmental justice, which is another prong of the climate plan. We're going to talk about the impact. So, it's great to talk about ESG, but how does it impact corporate America? How does it impact the insurance community? How does it impact the public and the investment community? So we're going to talk about some of those considerations. And then we're going to, of course, wield the crystal ball and see if we can't talk about some things that might be coming up, and some considerations that all those groups might have as this continues to grow. So with that, what is ESG? Quite simply, it stands for Environmental Social Governance. I said we're going to concentrate today on the environmental, although all 3 are really mixed in at certain junctures, as we'll talk through some of the issues. But ESG is simply a set of standards for a company's operation that measure its sustainability and social responsibility. In terms of environmental, it includes the kind of energy a company uses, the way it controls its emissions, if it's an industrial company, how it, what's its pollution management policies, what is its disposal policies, and how does that affect the environment? What kind of stewardship of nature is the company? And then from the social side, we'll see, how does a company have a relationship with its community and treat its workers and suppliers? And then more broadly, from even a corporate board level, how does this implement into treating those other 2 components in a corporate strategy? So in broad brush strokes, it's going to be something where companies are going to be measured by certain criteria and weighted up, on that criteria, almost to a, report card level of how they're doing it. Back in the day, before ESG, and some people want to talk about, corporate, CSR and some of the precursors to the ESG acronym, you would boycott a company's product, right? Send them a message. You wouldn't buy that product. This has taken it to a whole nother level, largely due to, the global framework, where, now you don't buy the company's stock. You set up funds or financial institutions that, promote only, that kind of reward ESG compliant companies and punish the ones that aren't. You influence government. So that's kind of where we are in terms of where this is going. I didn't know that much about ESG, candidly, until a couple of years ago. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I couldn't. I do like my life before I knew what ESG was. But there's no ignoring that it's coming, and it's going to have a substantial impact on, how corporate America operates within the investment and through the government. So with that, let's take you through just a brief timeline. I want to provide a little bit of context. We're not just coming out of left field here. So there, even back in the 1950s, there was pension funds that started to invest in corporate responsible activities. Then as you progress through the 60s and 70s, you have, the Clean Air Act. A young senator from Wisconsin created Earth Day, which is April 22nd. Unfortunately, I didn't know, but now I've remembered. But that, the first one in 1970 had 10% of the U.S. population, 20 million people. In 2020, it's over 1 billion people with more than 200 companies on board. In 1990, you have investment or social index fund that's created, that's starting to look at ESG related principles as a source of investing. Then you start to see kind of the globe, other countries, other nations starting to look at climate change, looking at the science, knowing that it is inevitable unless we make some changes, or at least propose some changes. And you're starting to see, the United Nations, the Kyoto Protocol, which is very important, that came into force. You see SASB established to try to standardize some of the things that a lot of these agreements put into framework, but didn't necessarily create criteria to measure. And then you see the Paris Agreement, which is an important global agreement, which, as we know, I think the U.S. went away from and now has come back to. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So with that kind of is the, I think the overall theme of this is that it's not just a contemporary trend, but this has been building for quite some time. It's only maybe since, the past 5 or 10 years, and really the past 5 years, that this thing has really taken off. And now that the administration has changed, they've embraced it. And so I think that's really going to be one of the drivers of how quickly this moves going forward. So before we get to the government, we're going to talk a little bit about the genesis of ESG in Europe and how it's translated into some of the issues we're seeing here now in the US. So with that, I'll turn it over to Drew Howard.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I think, when we talk about the timeline of ESG in the US and where we're potentially going in this country, it's helpful to look at least briefly at what's going on in Europe. Europe has really kind of led the charge on some of these ESG standards and disclosure issues over the last decade, really. And this summer, they rolled out the next step of a number of regulations. We'll touch on 2, briefly that are aiming to basically give investors a standard understanding of what they're putting their money in. And so the first thing that the European Commission tried to do is combat greenwashing, which is basically when a company is representing a product or a service that may be less environmentally sound than what they are describing it as. And the reason they're able to do this is because there really has not been a standard system to describe these different products until this taxonomy regulation rolled out. And what this is a standard set of definitions across industries to basically put environmental products in different buckets so you can get away from this, quote, greenwashing issue that they had. And then moving right off of that, this sustainable finance disclosure regulation is basically rules that say that any financial asset managers that operate in the EU have to disclose what is going on inside their portfolios. So the companies in their portfolios, what are they doing to benefit the environment or negatively impact the environment, or the social or governance goals. So it's interesting that in Europe, these regulations are targeted to the asset managers, not necessarily the companies. So the asset managers are tasked with understanding what's in their portfolio, but sometimes the companies are not held to the same level of disclosure, which can pose some interesting informational gaps at times. So that'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And then, what lessons we can take in the United States. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is basically a breakout. I found this pretty interesting. This is from a Bloomberg report, but it looks at the growth of ESG or sustainable assets under management over a decade. So you can see that in 2014, globally, we had about $15 trillion of assets under management. Bloomberg is projecting that by 2025, there will be $53 trillion in AUM for these ESG or sustainable funds. So it's a pretty marked increase. It's about a third of all assets under management or more. On this note, Bank of America came out with a study very recently that shows that there are three groups of people that are most likely to invest in ESG funds. So those groups are millennials, women, and high net worth individuals. And I wanted to think about the millennials for a second. It's fun to razz millennials as a generation. But it's estimated that over the next few decades, millennials stand to inherit or create upwards of $80 trillion in wealth. And you couple that with the findings of this survey that 87% of millennials are interested or already own ESG or sustainable products in their portfolios. And, that's potential for a large amount of capital to be moving into funds like this. So if you go to the next slide for me. Hopefully my sound works.
Oh, I'm having some difficulty getting to the next slide.
Boom. Okay. This is basically a breakout of fund allocation. So when we look at ESG sustainable funds, there's a number of classes that one could invest in. So different themes, if you will. So there are funds set up if you want to invest in funds that target companies that promote gender or diversity inclusion, you could invest in just that fund. The takeaway for me here from this slide is that the overwhelming majority of funds, and this is a fairly recent slide. This is from earlier this year. The majority of assets in these funds are targeted to what I would consider environmental funds. You see low carbon, renewable, water, general environmental. And so I do think it's safe to say that that is where the focus, at least in terms of dollars, has been to date. So we can go to the next. So, we've established that ESG has been growing in terms of at least the finance world pretty rapidly. And I think there's two major institutional drivers of this. We talked about Europe, we talked about the European government. They are obviously driving this through regulations that they have on the books. In the United States, we don't have at a federal level any clear regulations to date. I think our takeaway from the rest of this presentation is that they're coming soon, but to date, there are no federal level ESG regulations. But the growth of ESG funds in the United States has been fairly rapid. So the other institutional driver is investor demand. And I think, there's retail investor demand, you and me, and large institutional investors that have stated that ESG factors will be a priority to them in allocating capital. I think there are three basic ways that Pete kind of started to talk about this. There's three basic ways that someone would invest in ESG funds. The first would be choosing to not give your money to companies that don't align with your moral code, so to speak, and that would be the exclusionary screening. On the kind of the other side of the coin, you could choose to give your money to companies that you really favor, and that would be this positive selection. Historically, I think the understanding was that investors would do this and accept some return that might be less than what you would see in a general market fund. Although recent studies show that at least half of ESG investors today are doing so because they believe that their investments will generate above average returns or higher alpha returns than otherwise. Thematic investing is basically what we just looked at with fund allocations. If you want to give your money to a climate fund, you can do so. And then activist investing is nothing new, but in the climate change world, or in the ESG world, this is starting to take off more and more. This would be when a hedge fund or some group of investors would accumulate a position of leverage inside a publicly traded company that they deem to be a target for someone that they want to change their behavior. And if you can accumulate that position of leverage, then you could try to force a proxy vote or change the management structure. So it's a risk for companies that you should consider. Companies could potentially become a target if they're not fully aware of some of these risks. And then some of the other risks that we talked about, I talked about them already, so I won't bore you, but greenwashing, lack of standardization. It's just hard for investors to truly evaluate some of these investment opportunities at this point. And I think that's where some of these regulations are aiming to make that area a little better. So you can go to the next slide, Pete. Okay, so as you mentioned earlier, climate risk is really driving a lot of this. And when you focus on the E in ESG, it's not just do you create, bowls that can be composted. Understanding the risk that your company faces due to climate is an important part of being able to disclose these risks and having a higher ESG score. 60% of companies in the S&P 500 have assets that are at high risk of climate change. So, what are some of these risks? We're talking about sea level rise, flooding, the growth of wildfires, potential other natural catastrophe events. And, this can really cause a number of risks, but especially supply chain risk. Commodities could be impacted from flooding and could cause upstream issues. Or sea level rise could threaten industrials that have facilities near the coast. Chris or Lauren, I know that.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Drew. From a supply chain perspective, the U.S. companies have done a really good job of offshoring their manufacturing processes. And up until recently, many companies have turned a blind eye about the environmental practices, that employee health and safety standards. What we find is that a lot of these companies, and in some of these countries that are less developed, don't have the robust environmental laws that we have in the States and some other developed countries. And it potentially could create a tremendous reputational risk if a product is getting manufactured, people are dying, and the earth is getting severely impacted. And supply chain is a very important part of that. It's almost equivalent to know your banker, know your customer. You have to know who's manufacturing your product and what are they doing, because at the end of the day, it's a reputational risk to the firm. And resiliency, I could tell you, in the Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey market, where big box warehouses are everywhere, many of these warehouses are being built on the seaboard, the bay, or for rivers, for example. FEMA has determined that many of these sites are below FEMA floodplain. They all need to be raised in order to prevent future flooding events, coupled with the recent changes to DEP laws, where there needs to be clean fill imported onto these sites. And now in New Jersey, we have a severe shortage of clean fill. It's an evolving process, but I think when clients are developing warehouses in potentially flood zone areas now, and as you said, we have to speculate what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years. How do you build high enough? Where do you go? What steps can you take to make sure that your assets and your people are protected? Thank you, Drew.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. And I mean, just a final note on this, everything you raised is great. It's really expensive, especially in the context of sea level rise, if you're going to armor your coastlines or raise buildings. And so there's a lot there. There have been litigation recently over some of the costs of adaptation to climate change, but it can get very pricey.
And then we're not even discussing the potential, implications on the FEMA flood program, which is getting stretched daily.
In fact, it's not only the coasts that are impacted either. I mean, you have rising rivers, you have facilities that were built 30 or 40 years ago that are now experiencing different flooding aspects. And depending on where the infrastructure is or where those facilities are, it's a moving target. And so how do you, that's one of the things we help with. How do you model the climate change going forward and how it's going to impact those operations to the point where you feel more comfortable about that risk, and insurers feel more comfortable about insuring that risk.
And then how do the sewer systems and the drainage systems handle multiple 20-inch rainfall events, which have been happening quite a bit? It's very complicated. It's incredibly complicated.
So for anybody that knows Chris, that was probably for 20 years. That's the longest he's remained silent. So I'm glad we got him in on that slide. Won't be the last time you'll hear from him. So let's move forward. We're going to talk about this kind of like a another little mini agenda here. We're going to talk about Biden's climate plan. We're going to talk about him bringing in a whole bunch of different governmental agencies to make this work. Creating an ESG task force, creating an enforcement arm, and then what the anticipated regulatory framework is going to be. We're going to talk a little bit about the state and federal legislation, some of which is very ambitious, but some which may have some teeth and will affect things going forward. And then I wanted to mention the tri-reporting, because that's one of the things that the EPA has already been active on. And so we talk about ESG from like this 10,000 foot level. The EPA's already identified certain contaminants or substances that are being emitted into either the water or the atmosphere, and through this toxic release inventory, which measures these emissions in certain geographic areas, which we'll talk about with environmental justice. And then just overall, what limits is that going to pose for companies that use those compounds in their processes? And what kind of economic hurdles are they going to have to get over and to ensure that their processes are compliant? So I don't know if you wanted to jump in now, Lauren. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know. People might know you, but you seem more subdued than Chris. So
Has been hanging out listening.
Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a new administration brings its new priorities, but we have seen kind of a drastic shift in how the Trump administration was dealing with climate, and now how the Biden administration has announced not only its plans to deal with climate and looking forward, but has already started putting some of those plans into action already this year. President Biden on day one of his very first day one priorities was climate, and it was one of his top 4 priorities, along with COVID and very large scale issues, was climate. And he came out on the very first day and said that he was making climate a priority, and that climate change was something that his administration was going to tackle. We've seen that, not just through the Biden administration and their statements, but he has empowered the SEC to do that in a way that is, quite unprecedented in the way that the SEC handles matters, and is starting to forge a new path, meeting quite strong opposition going forward. But let's back it all the way up and say what happened in the very, very beginning here. President Biden nominated and Commissioner Gary Gensler, who has proven himself to be a quite aggressive potential regulator on climate issues. The SEC, of course, as we know, typically reviews financial issues, investor issues regarding stability of companies and boards, but for the first time has started to look at some of these ESG factors, and looking primarily at climate, but also other ESG factors such as some diversity requirements and some other governance factors. But looking at the climate issues, the SEC came out very strong. Even before Commissioner Gensler was officially confirmed, back in March, they started putting together their very first ESG and climate task force. And obviously that created a lot of news, that the SEC was starting to branch out into climate, was very big news and continues to be big news. So, what are kind of some of the priorities, I would say, that the SEC and the task force are looking at? The SEC and the task force have framed it in a way such that, for all the reasons that you guys have all spoken about, that investors are concerned about climate, about investing appropriately in climate funds, that companies that say that they're investing in climate, and the trillions of dollars that are going into it, that those disclosures are appropriate and accurate. And the SEC has framed it in a way saying that there needs to be proper disclosures and a regulatory framework around how these companies are now doing this, that this is all very brand new, and as companies start making these disclosures, that now is the appropriate time for the government to step in through the SEC and other regulatory bodies to start putting some frameworks around it and guidances for investors. That has, of course, been met by quite strong opposition from some dissenting SEC chair people, and also by Republican senators. They have argued that the SEC is pushing too far beyond its normal course and beyond the powers that have been entrusted into the SEC by the Constitution, and thus exceeding the authority granted to the SEC by Congress. And very recently, just last week, Gary Gensler sat before the U.S. Banking I'm sorry, the banking committee for the Senate, to discuss, a myriad of issues. And of course, ESG and climate came up. And again, he was met with rather robust questioning by Republican senators as to what the SEC was doing around climate and whether or not it was even appropriate in the first place. There were some quite pointed questions to Commissioner Gensler on it regarding, even the appropriateness of doing this and what the framework was going to be and how, this fit within the SEC's mandate as some Republican senators have seen it. So, it's obviously a very quickly developing an administrative and regulatory issue. Obviously, this was not something that we were even really looking at in 2020 under the Trump administration, but with the change in administration, we've really seen this warp speed kind of via the SEC, and anticipate that the SEC will be putting out an actual framework soon. And then, the horses will really be off, because then that's when pen hits paper for a lot of companies in terms of making sure that the proper disclosures are being met.
All right, Lauren, that was a great summation. And really talked a little bit about the pendulum, right, that swings back and forth on climate change, disclosure, really all the stuff we've talked about as the administrations change, whether they're presidential, whether they're congressional. There seems to be two different camps about how fast we need to move. And just quickly to go through the slide, these are some of the goals that the Biden administration has set. Some, very ambitious, energy carbon free by 2030. 2005 emissions he wants reduced by 50% by 2030, and then zero carbon emissions by 2050. And these are, I think, born principally upon some of the major tenets of the Paris Agreement and what other countries are trying to do in tandem with the rest of the world. And we talked about some of the prongs. We talked about some of the stricter environmental standards and regulations as it pertains to certain contaminants, especially the emerging contaminants. Some of the enforcement mechanisms that are going to be at play. There's going to be a bit of a carrot and stick approach, stick and carrot, however we want to classify it, where they're going to incentivize companies and other parties to be proactive, comply with the regulations with potential penalties if you don't. There's going to be a lot more transparency and corporate disclosure. And then eventually we're going to talk about a little bit about environmental justice. And then the one thing I wanted to mention on the executive order in May was that, the federal government's kind of, trying to practice what they preach. So they're examining all their operations, what the energy uses are, what the ESG criteria is for the U.S. government's use of energy and emissions through, U.S. government's a big entity. And one of the things I thought was interesting in that, they want to create a new federal flood risk management standard. Drew and Chris talked about how does that change the game. And then, federal lending, underwriting, and procurement. So they want disclosure of suppliers to the federal government of what their ESG standards are. They want, they're going to make, climate change related procurement decisions about who they use and give money to. And then there's going to be new underwriting standards in terms of, certain loans and conditions they're going to be ESG related too. We don't have a slide on it, but I really did want to touch briefly on the legislation. So, how do you pay for this? Biden's plan he came out with in January had a, $1.7 billion or $1 trillion price tag. It's now tied in with the $3.5 trillion price tag on the budget package that actually passed a Senate resolution recently It's before Congress. There's lots of components to it. I encourage you to take a look at the bill and see all the different components that are related to, climate change and some of the stuff we've been talking about. It's part of a larger, jobs package where he's trying to transition a lot of the jobs from quote unquote old energy to new energy. There's a $150 billion clean electricity performance program, which seeks to transition the company's energy from, coal and natural gas to, wind, solar, hydropower, nuclear. I think we'll see come back to a certain degree. And then what impact is that going to have to certain of those energy industries who are either on the way out, right? Let's keep it real, or could be bridge technologies to quote unquote, greener solution. And how long does that transition take place, and how does that impact the companies that are in that space? I think that's one of the bigger things I think a lot of those parties are looking at.
Yeah, and Pete, if I can just jump in. I mean, I think
Sure.
I think it's very important to stress, how current and in the moment that this is all developing so quickly and so rapidly. This bill has obviously been very hot in the news recently, but didn't exist a month ago. When Chairman Gensler was in front of the U.S. The Banking Committee for the Senate last week, this was the number one topic that they wanted to discuss before a lot of the other, Senate banking issues that you would think that they would want to consider. Is the number one topic that they wanted to discuss was climate and ESG. Who knows what this will look like potentially in 4 or 5 months. I know Pete and Drew maybe do. Maybe they're the two people who know what this will look like, by this time next year. But it's so of the moment and is so quickly developing. And I think it's fascinating on a kind of a geeky point of view, which is the point of view I am espousing here, just to see it evolving so quickly and to see kind of the two different forces struggling right at this moment to try to make these decisions on how climate is going to be looked at, the next 3 to 10 years. And it's all happening right now. The divisions are very clear within the SEC. The divisions are very clear in the government, and it's just going to be developing within the next few months to determine how this plays out.
I think Lauren brings up another great point. It's just the political nature of ESG. So, we've seen it through government. We're seeing it in other areas of the agencies, which many of them are supposed to be apolitical to a certain extent. So we're going to see how this legislation, if it gets through, potentially gets watered down, right? As many things do. So I think it's a kind of a wait and see at least from the legislative standpoint, what happens. So let's move on. This is, one of, I think, the critical parts of the plan. It's something, Lauren mentioned a lot of this in terms of the SEC being the arm that's going to drive this. There is a task force that's going to be an enforcement arm that is going to identify and punish ESG related misconduct.
I think it's interesting that the task force was created on the Division of Enforcement of all the divisions in the SEC. The climate and ESG task force was created on the Division of Enforcement, which really, I think, kind of gives you a hint and a preview as to what may come from there.
Yeah, if you look at the whole plan, it's pretty well thought out in terms of all the components that are put together to try to work together. So there is this, it starts with disclosure, you need to know. And then it also has this enforcement arm, which can investigate people that didn't disclose. And then obviously it has other components that are beyond, right, the disclosure standpoint, like the EPA, which can mandate certain disclosures for certain contaminants or environmental, remediation or what have you. And then you have the Treasury, who thinks that this is a global and a U.S. issue related to its U.S. financial system and how it operates within the global financial system. And they've actually instituted a climate czar on this very topic. So I think from the way things are operating and all the pieces that have been together, and this kind of goes back to the paper that Drew and I published back in the spring, that all the pieces are there and we're kind of seeing them play out now. I think one of the first things is going to be on disclosure, where we think, as early as October, you're going to see some type of disclosure requirement. The guidance goes back to 2010. Could give you kind of an idea of how this has progressed. It passed an investor advisory committee, SEC, back in May. They came up with a preliminary recommendation in December of 2020. There's been a public comment period this summer. And so I think October, we're going to see something that comes out. And what does that mean for corporations who either are too big to think this is material, or it wasn't material before these standards were set, but how onerous and how complex are these new regulations going to be, where you have to go back to formula, but go back and investigate and look at what your environmental management system or plan is. Doesn't need to be updated, doesn't need to be created. Do you have one? And so I think those are all questions that are going to come out from the disclosure standpoint. Transparency is normally good. In ESG, transparency may have a substantial cost associated with it to comply. So if you look at the end of this slide, this is one of the, as Lauren mentioned, one of the things that this is actually back in July that Gensler mentioned, just in terms of the investment community needing certain rules. This is a great slide that Drew put together. Just want everybody to appreciate it. But these are the comments that he made from a week ago, where he's talking about the same things and kind of taking it up a notch in terms of what the disclosures need to be for the investment community and the public at large. We teased it a bunch of times, environmental justice. We're mixing now the E and the S in ESG. So there's a kind of definition that the EPA has come up with. This is part of and a major prong of Biden's environmental justice plan. So he's basically created a different division within the U.S. Department of Justice to prosecute these type of actions. And I think that's actually going to lead to, and we've heard the rumors from, say keep it real, but plaintiff law firms are watching all this. They're investigating what types of suits could produce personal injury and other environmental actions that will create damages. And this is one area where you have a segment of the population, some lower socioeconomic sections of the population living in certain census tracts of the country. Everybody wants to talk about Cancer Alley, where you could try to monetize some of the anticipated regulatory restrictions on some of the contaminants that are being emitted in these populations or communities. And then what type of cancers can they try to create causation to? And so there is a litigation risk that I think is inherent with environmental justice. We've seen it with lead litigation and other mass torts. I think this is another potential area that we will see potentially some litigation come out of as this becomes more defined. And with that, I'll hand it over to Drew to continue on.
I see Chris has his hand raised.
Yeah, I have to tell you that from my world, from a site pollution world, where a lot of these buildings or operations are in distressed areas or historically have been, It's creating a whole lot of concern amongst the insurance community. And the reason is because these policies not only pay remediation expense and liability resulting from remediation, known or unknown, but it also pays legal defense. And when you go out and hire environmental counsel, like any other counsel, it's not a cheap or easy task to defend these matters. And as we know, the duty to defend is much broader in the insurance world than the duty to indemnify. So it's going to create some uncertainty from an underwriting perspective to see where it goes. I know New Jersey and California seem to be leading the pack, and but so far, the real estate market still continues to be very hot. So we'll see what the ultimate impact of EJ is on a burgeoning commercial and industrial insurance market. It'll be interesting. Thanks, Drew. All yours.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's all great. I think in the interest of time, maybe let's move down to corporate response. I would ask the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to punch them into the little Q&A feature. And
sure. And real quick, these are maps, not very good maps, but they are mapping out geographic areas of the country which have certain contaminants in them. And this will provide, to Chris's point, potential litigation roadmap, depending on what those contaminants are and whether it forces either defense costs or indemnity costs.
We talked about climate risk earlier too, and there's a large overlap between areas where low-income communities or historically marginalized communities live, and areas where there's increased risk of climate change. So what we talked about on some of the sea level rise slides, just more considerations to think about when determining your impact with these factors. So, we talked about what companies need to do, and the short story is, you need to understand what these federal regulations are saying. That is difficult when there aren't any federal regulations on the books yet, which is why you call it consultant. But thankfully, I think we feel pretty confident in saying that disclosure requirements are coming down the pipe in some fashion. And although nothing is mandated yet, there are a lot of companies that have voluntarily been disclosing a lot of their environmental impacts. And there are some frameworks that exist that help companies kind of understand how to go about these disclosure requirements. I won't dig into this too deeply, but Pete, for example, mentioned SASB earlier, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. That's an industry-specific standards. They have like 77 industries that they cover, and they help companies understand how sustainability risk impacts their own financial performance. It's an inward-looking tool that would help you talk about your environmental or sustainability risk. On that same coin, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is a set of metrics or targets to help companies report on risks or governance issues. We're economic consultants. We like data analytics as much as the next folks, I suppose. But companies really need to understand their internal processes. So what impacts are you having? Your own energy use, your water use. I think companies have some understanding already of pollution liability potentially. And reading the tea leaves in some versions of disclosure regulations coming to the US, you might have very onerous disclosures required for carbon emissions. And so there's potential there for that to get pretty tricky. So collecting these data and understanding your processes early is very important. And so one thing that we would suggest companies would start doing, a first step would be to create an environmental management plan or an environmental management system, which is something that, Root does for clients. Lauren, did you have anything to add before?
Yeah. I just wanted to say, I think we can draw some parallels from litigation we saw around diversity against large corporations in 2020, around corporations that were promising one thing but doing something else. There were lawsuits against Oracle, Facebook, things like that around diversity. And drawing parallels from that, I do think climate disclosures can't just be kind of based on what I like to call hopes and dreams, that they do need to be backed by real data, real information that the company is already doing, or if there are plans to be doing in the future, that there are concrete plans and real action items around that. I think putting out any disclosures by companies is fraught for potential peril in terms of litigation. And so it has to be done carefully and measured and really backed by real numbers and data that the company either has or can go out there and collect before putting out disclosures.
Yeah, that's a particularly salient point, I think. You move to the next slide, Pete. I'll just touch on this really quickly. One of the first steps companies will do, it's pretty much what Lauren just said. Setting up an environmental management plan or system is basically a first step, something that clients can or companies could give to potential investors or regulators. And it's coming up with a policy on how you would want to move forward to meet some of these ESG standards. So that involves setting goals, and then we would call it a materiality assessment, but looking internally on all of those usages of energy and water, like we discussed earlier, setting achievable targets, and then kicking that plan in place. And then this sets as a continual system of continually improving, checking, and moving forward. But we'll go to the next slide because I know we want to talk about insurers. We have our resident insurance guru, Chris, here. So I will kick this to him quickly, but the takeaway, I think, is that, insurers are risk managers, and I think they play a central role in identifying and measuring a lot of these material ESG risks, which can particularly be climate risk. And that can have implications on operational risk, or as the slide notes, litigation risk in some cases. So Chris, do you have anything?
I think that what we're going to see, especially from an environmental or more relevant now, is from property insurance, is with the flooding in the South, in the Northeast, the wildfires in California. Insurance companies are going to retrench. I think it has to happen. Because there's only so much insurance limit to go around. There's only so much reinsurance limit to go around. And at some point, it becomes a case of diminishing returns, where the insurance companies can't obtain or attract enough investment or opportunity for investment or gain to make it worthwhile. And you see it in California. Liability carriers have been excluding losses resulting from wildfires now. I think it's going to be very interesting course to tell. Definitely the insurance is going to become more expensive on the property side, on the environmental side. It's going to be harder to get. And the question is, in the absence of insurance, what would you do? What's in the best interest of the stakeholders? And that has to be first and foremost. And if you can answer that question and provide those answers with your broker to an insurance company in a sound and concise manner with a clear plan, it makes you a better insured. It makes you more attractive to an insurance company. And because if you can't answer those questions, you have other problems, right? You may not be able to get the insurance. So understanding that the insurance companies are here to make money and make investment return for their stakeholders, provide some element of risk sharing, is going to make the best of a very bad and difficult situation going forward.
I think on a basic level, the insurers and the investors have the same economic incentives,
Yeah.
right? The less risky a company is,
Yeah.
the less risk there's going to be for a downside scenario.
Yeah.
But, I think from that standpoint, and to your point, I don't think it's happened, but I could anticipate a world where insurers would be more reticent to issue a policy or have premiums that escalate if a company doesn't meet certain ESG standards.
Or are we going to follow the model of the FEMA flood or the terrorism pool? Is there going to be some type of pooling, a public-private partnership? We don't know. We don't know, but I can tell you that it's interesting. And insurance it's almost like a conundrum, right? If you look at the property insurance market has gone insane over the last 2 to 3 years because the premiums have gone through the roof because the losses have gone up. But as the premiums go through the roof, the returns become higher, especially if there are no losses. It attracts more competition. The premiums come down, and it's cyclical. It happens over and over again. But if we keep on having catastrophic losses on a global scale every year without a break, who wants to come in? Or the baseline rates are going to be so high that why move? Then the question comes, if I have a choice between two carriers and they're both charging the same rate, but if I have longevity with carrier A as opposed to carrier B, why would I change? It's a tough one. I mean, thank God I don't sell property insurance.
All great points.
Yeah.
All right. So in the interest of time, we're going to head to, kind of the impact for the investment community and talking about, I'll turn it over to Laura in a second, but can this circular disclosure and transparency be achieved, right? It's been driven by investment, which is driving, corporations to create more disclosure and transparency, which is also being driven by government, because if they don't, they could be punished. And is there, almost like back to Drew's circular slide, can there be this kind of symbiosis between all three that gives everybody the comfort of, disclosure, while still meeting some of the goals that the government wants to hit? And this slide's also for anybody that doesn't think that ESG can impact your person, 401ks. So, the Trump administration created a rule where ESG is not to be considered, or at least not a major consideration in some of the 401k funds, 401k funds. That's being reconsidered now by the Biden administration. And so that'll be one of the things that I think will happen in 2022 related to some of those 401k investments. And if there are either selections that will be mandated where you have the choice to pick an ESG fund, or they're just part of the overall package, I think that remains to be seen. This chart just shows you, like we were talking about before. So I think one of the things this chart shows you that we talked about, the pendulum swinging back and forth between administrations. The investment community doesn't care. They're driving the ship. So it's going to grow regardless of who's in power. And this next slide will show you just some of how the funds are performing over time, at least in 2020. I don't know if Lauren, if you had anything to add on the investment front.
Up until today, Peter, because our market is tanking.
No, I mean, I just, in the interest of time, I mean, I think it's, corporations need to be really careful, obviously, between activists, funds really trying to get in there and take more control, individual investors have shown a lot of interest, as Drew mentioned, obviously, in these issues. And now, right, as we've been discussing, the government is starting to respond. Companies really need to be paying a lot of attention to the next few months and how disclosures are going to, regulatory framework is going to change and disclosure frameworks are going to change. And they're going to have to really, really be paying attention to it and making sure they're responding in accord, because this is a really quite large shift from how the SEC and other government agencies have been acting, at least through the past administration, if not, prior decades.
All right, so with that, we got a couple of things we threw out there just as things that we see that either companies should be doing or insurers should be considering. I think there isn't anything that's slowing this down. So I think this is going to become a bigger issue as more of the pieces are put in place, and more importantly, as those pieces start to transform this into action, we're going to see this really impact companies. The way they report, the way those reports are received by the public and the investment community, the way those reports are received by the government, what other regulations or restrictions are put on industry. I think there'll be more of a push for environmental justice, and I think the pace will speed up. Just because, well, the pace will speed up as much as other things in the administration or politically or globally allow. But I think, under the Biden administration, just in this first year, it's taken off. And does he get it far enough where, given some of the scientific concerns, it has to be done now? Or whether that is rolled back if the administration changes? I think that's one of the questions a couple of years from now we'll have. But I think from an investment and the government standpoint, this is going to be one of the major focuses over the next couple of years. And I'll turn it over to anybody else that wants to chime in. I don't know if we have any questions too.
I just want to offer one final note. It's important to note that those individuals that are investing in brownfield redevelopment laws need to remember that environmental liabilities are joint and several. It goes beyond the entity. It could go to the individuals. And it really ties in well with Lauren and what she does in her practice, because D&O policies provide, Lauren, I may be stepping over my skis here.
No,
Side A, individual liability, and side B, entity corporate liability. And I think they're kind of mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
They go together.
I'm trying, being kind of time, obviously the impacts of the D&O insurance are going to be profound. I mean, we've already seen D&O underwriters start asking about ESG, what kind of disclosures companies are already making, drawing parallels again from some of the other ESG type lawsuits being filed. We'll certainly see lawsuits being filed after the SEC comes out with their regulatory framework.
Yeah. And
companies that aren't meeting that threshold will certainly see, shareholder suits and things like that, which will directly impact the D&O insurance. And so having proper D&O insurance to protect the board, both the side B that protects the company and side A protecting the individual directors, is going to become more important than ever. Just because, there will be a catch up between when the new regulatory framework comes out and when companies can catch up into kind of an appropriate pace. And there will be litigation in that middle space that will impact D&O insurance, certainly.
Yep. Drew, anything?
I think we got the over. We got the over there.
Okay.
I don't know if there was any questions. Wanted to let everybody know that we're all available if you want to reach out to any of us, ask questions. But if there's any Q&A, feel free to chime in now.
Peter, I think your dogs like your presentation.
I think there's another Amazon delivery driver at my house.
There you go. This is good. Amber, we don't have anything in the queue, right? Oh, wait. No questions. All right. So I think we can break. So on behalf of NFP, Lauren, I don't want to, please chime in here. I think that we thank you for your time and your attention on a very complicated and quickly evolving topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It's great to partner with NFP on this.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Drew and Peter. Thank you, Amber. Be well.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us today. To reiterate, we recorded today's presentation and the recording will be available in Academy within 2 business days. Finally, at this time, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to take a short survey today. The survey will populate in a new window when you exit out of Zoom. Please take a moment to complete the survey as it lets us know what topics are important to our listeners and helps make our education program as current and relevant as possible. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining us and have a great day.